Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Disinformation Chronicle. I want to talk about this consent decree that came down last week. It was a settlement between plaintiffs who had sued the Biden administration, well, the federal government now, it's now Trump, over the censorship issues. And what was alleged is that the Biden administration was censoring by proxy. Essentially, they were putting pressure on the social media companies to shut down information that they didn't like. And so we're finally seeing this settled in the last week. And one of the plaintiffs who was involved in this case is a physician, Aaron Cariarty. And his quote was, "With yesterday's settlement agreement, we can finally declare victory in our case, Missouri v. Biden, challenging government-sponsored censorship on social media." The consent decree, it's now going to prohibit the federal government from suppressing Americans' rights to voice certain views. And this lawsuit was actually launched all the way back in 2020. And there was some interesting stuff that came up in what's called the discovery documents. So the documents that were found by the plaintiffs who were suing the federal government. And they found some pretty good evidence that there was suppression happening. So one of the documents that caught my attention on Twitter was exchanges back in 2021 between Facebook and the Biden White House. And it was very clear from these emails that the Biden White House was trying to get Facebook to censor and suppress any viewpoints that were critical about the vaccines as they were rolling out the COVID vaccine mandates. And this one email back in March 2021, you can see Facebook is emailing two Biden administration officials, Andy Slavitt, who was a senior person inside the Biden White House, and Rob Flaherty, who ran comms for a while and then ended up working to run communications for Kamala Harris when she ran against Trump. And in this email, what Facebook is telling them is they're saying, "We have been focused on reducing the virality of content discouraging vaccines that does not contain actionable misinformation." So they're trying to suppress things. It's not even wrong, right? They actually even say in the next sentence, "This is often true content." And this was critical because in March of 2020, when this deal was struck, of course, none of us knew about this because this email came out later as part of a lawsuit. Well, later that year, the BMJ assigned me to do an article about Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial. We had a whistleblower who came forward with a bunch of internal documents, secret recordings showing that that clinical trial was a complete mess. And the FDA was not monitoring these clinical trials effectively, probably because they just wanted the vaccine out there and they wanted people to get it in their arms. So after this article came out, it went viral. It had 73,000 tweets on X. There's a way of rating the impact of scientific articles called altmetric. And this article now has, I think, the second or third highest altmetric score ever. So it was being seen all over the place, and especially on social media. So essentially it was viral, right? And it had true content, right? And we know it was true because Pfizer didn't complain about it. They couldn't find anything wrong with it. Their lawyers, they couldn't find anything wrong with it. About a week after it came out, Australia's regulator began asking Pfizer about it. What's going on with this BMJ article? Well, surprise, a Facebook fact checker then popped up immediately and said, "This thing lacks context," and it had a URL that said it's a hoax alert, right? Well, there was nothing wrong with it, and the BMJ editors were so pissed off, they actually sent an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg complaining about his inaccurate, incompetent, and irresponsible fact check. Zuckerberg didn't do anything about it. We all moved on. There were a bunch of articles that came out that pointed out how crazy this fact check was, but nothing really happened. And because what we didn't know at the time, of course, is that there's a deal that had already been struck, right, between Facebook and the White House that they were going to attack an article like this anyway. We didn't know that at the time because these emails only came out later. Well, in September of 2024, Zuckerberg finally admitted that he'd been pressured by the Biden White House and sent a letter out apologizing for it from this government pressure from the Biden White House to censor COVID-19 content. So we know it happened. We know there was pressure applied from the Biden White House on these social media companies. It came out, and this lawsuit's kind of a settlement, for it. And what this settlement actually says is it's going to ban the federal government from actions, formal or informal, directly or indirectly, to threaten social media companies with some form of punishment. This could be adverse legal, regulatory, economic, government sanctions, right? I mean, they regulate these companies. They could increase their taxes. Who knows what they might do to them unless they remove, delete, suppress, or reduce, including altering the algorithms so that you can't see it, right? Any type of social media content that contains protected speech. So this is what the injunction says, and this is going to be made in place for the next 10 years. And when the case actually came before the Supreme Court in 2024, the Supreme Court decided not to hear it and remanded it back to the lower courts. This is why you haven't heard about this, because what the media told us at the time is that it had been defeated, that it had been tossed. The media told us that this case didn't matter anymore. They lost this case. There was no suppression. There was no censorship, right? Nature magazine actually came out with a piece that said it vindicated these embattled misinformation researchers, right? And that they're celebrating the Supreme Court decision. Well, that's not true. What this settlement actually does, it highlights specifically the role that these misinformation researchers play. And here's what one section says. The parties also agreed that government, politicians, media, academics, or anyone else applying such labels as, and these are academic labels that are being used all the time, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation to speech, does not render it constitutionally unprotected. So guess what? You can make all these things up, but people aren't going to act on it anymore. That's essentially what that's saying. Well, I've actually dealt with some of these information academics. One was Claire Wardle. She's the one who started all this movement back in 2016. Another one's Renee DiResta. She was a woman who, when I went to Twitter, I found out that she essentially popped out of nowhere. And when she first came on the scene, she was so ridiculous that internally I found these Twitter emails where they were dismissing her as a disinformation hobbyist. And they only began working with her after Stanford, for reasons that no one to this day understands, gave her a job and gave her a Stanford email. At that point, they started to interact with her. And then we later find out that she had actually worked for a cyber company called New Knowledge that actually had engaged in a disinformation campaign during an American election, right? So the disinformation expert, right, doesn't really know anything. She's not an expert at anything. And the company she worked for actually engaged in misinformation during an American election. So should we be shocked that Renee DiResta is still spitting out misinformation? No, of course we couldn't. Because when the Supreme Court decided not to hear this case, which we now know is real because there's a settlement, she actually said that it had been tossed. Well, it wasn't tossed. We now have a settlement that shows that this is not going to be happening anymore, at least anytime in the near future. So I hope you can understand a little bit more about what's happening with the censorship in America. There are huge problems still ongoing in Europe, which I'm going to keep reporting on. So stick around. Please hit the subscribe button, and I'll be back with you with more information about censorship because it's not going to stop. Thanks so much, guys, and have a great day.